The cloud of dirt stirred up by Jacob Whitmore's wagon wheels lingered in the still air like an unreceived blessing, drifting down slowly onto the drought-stricken ground of Wyoming territory. The summer of 1882 had shown no mercy, sapping vitality from both crops and human spirits with ruthless indifference. Jacob tugged his worn hat further down over his brow, shielding his eyes from the relentless afternoon sun that hammered his shoulders like strikes from a vengeful destiny. His faithful mare, Old Belle, trudged ahead with the resigned persistence of an animal that had witnessed countless difficult journeys and understood that more lay in wait. The path to Sweetwater Creek extended before them like a wound carved into the earth, rough and unrelenting. Jacob had traveled this route numerous times throughout the previous 15 years, transporting goods from town to his humble ranch on the edges of the frontier. Every journey presented its own obstacles, yet today carried a different weight somehow, laden with an anticipation he couldn't identify. The quiet was interrupted only by the groaning of leather and timber, Belle's rhythmic hoofbeats, and the soft rustling of wind through the meager grass that fought to survive in this harsh terrain. That's when he spotted her, a tiny form huddled beside the road like a forgotten plaything. Initially, Jacob suspected his vision was deceiving him, the heat conjuring false images of hope where none should exist. However, as his wagon approached, the mirage became solid reality. A young girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, sat with her knees pulled tight against her chest, her face hidden in her arms. Her delicate frame trembled with sobs that seemed far too overwhelming for such a small being to hold. Jacob drew back on the reins, bringing Belle to a gentle halt. The abrupt cessation of movement appeared to intensify the Sioux, Hild's weeping, each sob slicing through the afternoon stillness like a blade through fine fabric. He remained seated momentarily, hesitation pressing heavily upon his chest. In this untamed territory, wariness often meant the distinction between witnessing another dawn and becoming carrion for scavengers. Yet observing this tiny, shattered figure, Jacob felt something awaken within him that had nothing to do with survival instincts and everything to do with the type of person his deceased wife Sarah had always known him to be. Descending from the wagon with the deliberate movements of a man whose body bore the memory of every grueling day of his 45 years, Jacob approached the child cautiously. His boots created soft grinding sounds in the earth, and at this noise, the little girl raised her head, revealing eyes that contained far too much anguish for someone who had barely begun living. Her face was marked with tears and dirt, forming muddy tracks down her cheeks. Her dress, once likely blue, now matched the color of the soil itself, torn in multiple places and hanging loosely on her slight frame. "Easy there, little one," Jacob spoke gently, his voice carrying the soothing tone he had previously used with skittish horses. "Where might your family be?" He crouched at a respectful distance, making himself appear less intimidating to the frightened child. His heart constricted as he took in her condition more completely. She was painfully thin, with the sunken-cheeked appearance of someone who had known starvation as an unwanted companion for far too long. The girl's lips quivered as she attempted to speak, her voice barely audible. "They're gone," she managed, fresh tears overflowing. "The fever claimed Mama 3 days ago, and Papa—" Her voice shattered completely and she dissolved into renewed weeping. "Papa wouldn't wake up this morning. I waited and but he just wouldn't wake up." Jacob felt his own throat constrict with emotion. He had witnessed too much death during his frontier years, had laid to rest his own share of dreams alongside the bodies of those he cherished. Yet something about this child's raw sorrow cut directly through all the defensive walls he had constructed around his heart. Without conscious decision, he found himself moving nearer, his weathered hand extending to gently touch her shoulder. "I'm truly sorry, child." The word seemed insufficient, like attempting to stop a torrent with bare hands. "What might your name be?" "Emma," she whispered. "Emma Catherine Morrison." She articulated her complete name with the careful precision of a child who had been taught proper etiquette, even in the face of disaster. "We were heading to California, Papa and Mama and me. Papa claimed there was gold there, enough to make us wealthy, but then Mama fell ill, and we stopped by the creek back there to rest, and then she couldn't continue, her small body racked with fresh sobs. Jacob glanced back down the road where she had indicated, barely making out the dark silhouette of a wagon in the distance. His stomach twisted as he imagined what he might discover there. "How long have you been waiting here, Emma?" "Since sunrise," she replied, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "I didn't know what else to do. Papa always had the answers, but now he's gone, and I'm completely alone, and I don't know how to reach California by myself." The late afternoon sun was already beginning its descent toward the western mountains, coloring the sky in hues of amber and gold. Jacob realized this child had been sitting here for hours, exposed to the elements and the dangers that prowled these desolate spaces, mountain lions, wolves, and worse still, the kind of men who would view a helpless child as easy prey. The thought chilled his blood. "Listen to me, Emma," he said, his voice adopting the firm yet gentle tone he had once used with his own daughter before cholera claimed her 10 years prior. "You cannot remain here. It isn't safe. Do you understand?" She nodded, her eyes wide with a combination of fear and trust that nearly shattered his heart. "But where can I go? I don't have anyone left. Papa said we had no relatives back east. California was supposed to be our fresh beginning." Jacob rose slowly, his mind racing through options and responsibilities. The sensible choice would be to transport her to town, leave her with the sheriff or perhaps the minister's wife. Allow someone else to handle this tragedy while he continued with his affairs. That would be the practical decision, the safe choice. However, as he looked down at Emma's tear-stained face, he discovered that practicality seemed like an indulgence he couldn't afford. "Come along," he said, extending his hand to her. "Let's see about your folks first. They deserve a proper burial." Emma's small hand slipped into his calloused one, and Jacob felt a surge of responsibility that transcended simple Christian obligation. This child was now his burden, his duty, and perhaps something more that he wasn't quite prepared to acknowledge. Together they walked back toward his wagon, Emma's steps uncertain and unsteady with exhaustion. The Morrison wagon sat tilted at an awkward angle, one wheel having sunk deep into the soft earth near the creek bank. As Jacob had dreaded, the smell reached him first, the sickeningly sweet odor of death in summer heat. He squeezed Emma's hand gently. "Stay here with Belle," he instructed her. "I'll handle everything." Inside the wagon, Jacob discovered the bodies of Emma's parents. Her mother, a woman who might have once possessed beauty, lay on a makeshift bed of quilts and blankets. Even in death, her face revealed the toll of fever, skin stretched taut over prominent bones. Her husband lay beside her, one arm thrown protectively over her still form. He was a large man, or had been before illness and hardship had worn him down. His face appeared peaceful, almost relieved, and Jacob wondered if he had simply surrendered when faced with the prospect of continuing alone with his grief and his daughter. Jacob spent the following 2 hours digging graves in the hard-packed earth, while Emma sat in the shade of his wagon, too exhausted and overwhelmed to do more than observe with hollow eyes. The sun was touching the horizon by the time he completed the task, his shirt drenched with perspiration and his hands bloodied from gripping the shovel. He wrapped the bodies carefully in their own quilts, murmuring prayers his own mother had taught him over each grave as he covered them with the unforgiving Wyoming soil. When the burial was finished, Jacob fashioned a simple cross from pieces of the damaged wagon and carved the names as accurately as he could recall them. Emma approached slowly, clutching a small cloth doll that had seen better days. She knelt beside the graves and placed a few wildflowers she had gathered, her lips moving in silent words that Jacob couldn't hear but felt in his very soul. "They're in a better place now," he told her, meaning it more than he had meant anything in years. "They're at peace." Emma nodded, but her tears had begun again. "What's going to become of me now?" she asked, her voice so small it was nearly lost in the evening breeze. Jacob knelt beside her, his decision made without conscious thought, but with the certainty of a man who had finally found his true direction. "You're going to come home with me," he said simply. "If that's what you desire. I have a small ranch about 10 miles from here. It's modest, but it's secure, and there's room for one more." Emma's eyes widened, and for the first time since he had found her, something resembling hope flickered across her features. "Really? You'd want me?" The question struck Jacob like a physical blow. Want her? This child who had lost everything, who had been abandoned by fate and circumstance to perish alone beside the road. He thought of his empty house, of the silence that had filled the rooms since Sarah's death, of his daughter's bedroom he still couldn't bear to enter. Perhaps destiny had a sense of irony after all, taking away his family only to place another lost soul directly in his path. "Emma," he said, his voice thick with unexpected emotion, "I'd be honored to have you, but you need to understand it won't be simple. Ranch life demands hard work, and I'm not one for fancy things or city ways. It'll just be you and me against whatever comes." "I can work," Emma said quickly, desperately. "Mama taught me to cook and sew and tend chickens. I won't be a burden, I promise. I'll earn my keep." "Child," Jacob said, reaching out to smooth her tangled hair, "you don't need to earn anything. You're not hired help. You'd be family." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and promise. Emma stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether she could trust this unexpected kindness. Finally she nodded, and Jacob felt something in his chest that had been clenched tight for years finally begin to relax. They loaded what few belongings could be salvaged from the Morrison wagon into Jacob's, including Emma's small satchel of clothes and the precious doll she clutched like a lifeline. As complete darkness settled over the prairie, Jacob lit a lantern and guided Belle carefully along the familiar path toward home. Emma sat beside him on the wagon seat, swaying with exhaustion but fighting to stay awake, as if afraid that sleep might make this rescue vanish like a dream. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, her voice barely audible over the creaking of the wagon wheels. Jacob found himself smiling for the first time in months. "Well, it's not much to look at from the outside, just a cabin and a barn and some pasture for the cattle, but it has a good well and a view of the mountains that'll take your breath away come sunrise. Sarah always said—" He paused, surprised that speaking his wife's name didn't cause as much pain as it usually did. "My wife always said it was the most beautiful place on earth when the wildflowers bloomed in spring." "Will you tell me about her?" Emma asked. "About Sarah?" And so, as Belle carried them through the star-filled darkness toward home, Jacob found himself talking about his late wife for the first time since her death. He told Emma about Sarah's laughter, which could fill a room with joy, and her terrible cooking, which he had pretended to enjoy for 15 years of marriage. He spoke about her garden, where she had coaxed impossible beauty from the harsh soil, and her dream of having children who would fill their home with noise and chaos and love. "She would have loved you," he said finally, and realized he meant it completely. "She always said our house was too quiet, that it needed the sound of little feet running through it." Emma had fallen asleep against his shoulder by the time the warm glow of lantern light appeared in the distance, marking the location of Jacob's cabin. He carried her inside gently, laying her on the sofa and covering her with one of Sarah's quilts. She stirred slightly but didn't wake, her small face peaceful for the first time since he had found her. Jacob sat in his kitchen long into the night, drinking coffee that had grown cold hours ago and staring at the sleeping child. The magnitude of what he had undertaken was beginning to sink in. He was 45 years old, set in his ways, accustomed to the solitary life of a widower. What did he know about raising a little girl? How could he possibly fill the void left by her parents? But even as doubt crept in, Jacob found himself remembering the look in Emma's eyes when he had promised she would be family. For the first time in 10 years, he had purpose beyond mere survival. This child needed him, not just for shelter and food, but for something deeper and more fundamental. She needed someone to believe in her future, to help her heal from wounds that went far deeper than grief. The next morning, Jacob woke to the sound of someone moving around in his kitchen. For a moment, still caught between sleep and waking, he thought Sarah had returned from the grave to make him breakfast. But then he remembered, and he found Emma standing on a chair at his stove, carefully tending eggs in his iron skillet. She had washed her face and attempted to braid her hair, though the result showed more enthusiasm than skill. "I hope you don't mind," she said, glancing at him nervously. "I woke up early and you were still sleeping, and I thought maybe I could make breakfast. Mama taught me how." Jacob watched her for a moment, this small person who was trying so hard to prove her worth, and felt his heart expand in ways he had forgotten were possible. "That's mighty thoughtful of you, Emma." But you know you don't have to take care of me, don't you? That's not why you're here. She turned to face him, her expression serious beyond her years. But I want to help. I need to do something useful, or else I'll just think about Mama and Papa all the time, and then I'll cry, and crying doesn't help anybody. Jacob recognized the wisdom in her words, the instinctive understanding that purposeful work could be a salve for grief. He nodded and moved to help her reach the plates on the high shelf. All right then, but from now on, we work together, partners. Partners, Emma repeated solemnly, as if sealing a sacred pact. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that surprised Jacob with its naturalness. Emma threw herself into ranch life with the fierce determination of someone who had learned that home was not guaranteed, that belonging had to be earned and protected. She fed the chickens and gathered eggs, helped Jacob mend fences, and tended to the small vegetable garden Sarah had started years before. In the evenings she would sit by the fire with her mending while Jacob read aloud from whatever books he had, her small fingers working steadily while her mind wandered through stories of adventure and distant lands. But it was not all easy adjustment and peaceful domesticity. There were nights when Jacob would wake to the sound of Emma crying in her sleep, calling out for parents who would never answer. There were moments when she would stop in the middle of some task, overwhelmed by memories that hit her like physical blows. During these times, Jacob would simply be present, offering comfort without trying to fix what could not be fixed, understanding that some wounds could only heal with time. The first real test of their new arrangement came 3 weeks after Emma's arrival, when a group of drifters stopped by the ranch asking for water and food. Jacob had dealt with their kind before and recognized the danger immediately. These were men who had abandoned civilized behavior along with civilized society. Men who saw weakness as an opportunity and kindness as a flaw to be exploited. Their leader was a tall, lean man with cold eyes and a smile that never reached beyond his lips. He introduced himself as Tom Brennan and claimed they were just passing through looking for honest work. But Jacob noticed how his gaze lingered on Emma, who had instinctively moved closer to Jacob's side, and how the other men positioned themselves strategically around the yard. Mighty pretty little girl. You got there, Brennan said, his voice carrying an undertone that made Jacob's blood turn to ice. She your daughter? She is, Jacob replied firmly, his hand moving casually toward the rifle, leaning against the porch railing. And she's under my protection. Brennan's smile widened, but his eyes remained calculating. Now don't get all worked up, friend. We're just making conversation. Times are hard, and a man's got to think about his future, you understand? Little girl like that, she's going to need proper schooling, proper care, more than one old rancher can provide out here in the middle of nowhere. Emma pressed closer to Jacob's side, her small hand gripping his shirt. She might not have understood all the implications of Brennan's words, but she could sense the threat as clearly as any wild animal sensing a predator. Jacob felt her trembling and knew that whatever happened next, he could not show weakness. The girl is exactly where she belongs, Jacob said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had faced down cattle rustlers and claim jumpers. And I suggest you and your friends move along before you wear out your welcome. For a moment, the tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Jacob could see Brennan weighing his options, calculating the odds. 3 armed men against 1 middle-aged rancher and a child should have been no contest. But something in Jacob's steady gaze and confident posture gave the outlaw pause. Perhaps he sensed that this was not a man who would go down without a fight, or perhaps he simply decided the potential reward wasn't worth the certain risk. No offense intended, Brennan said finally, his tone suggesting anything but apology. We'll just water our horses and be on our way. Jacob nodded curtly, but didn't move from his position until the 3 men had mounted up and ridden out of sight. Only then did he feel Emma's grip on his shirt loosen slightly. Were they bad men? She asked in a small voice. Yes, Jacob said, seeing no point in sugarcoating the truth. They were bad men, but they're gone now, and they won't be back. How do you know? Jacob looked down at this child, who had already seen too much of life's cruelty, and he chose his words carefully. Because some fights aren't worth having, Emma. They could see I was ready to protect you no matter what it cost me, and men like that are cowards at heart. They only pick on people who can't fight back. As summer faded into autumn, Jacob began the process of legally adopting Emma. The paperwork was complicated, requiring multiple trips to the county seat and interviews with officials who seemed skeptical that a bachelor rancher was suitable to raise a young girl. But Emma herself, when questioned, was unwavering in her desire to stay with Jacob. She spoke with the composed certainty of someone who had seen the worst life could offer and recognized genuine safety when she found it. The town doctor, a kindly man named Henderson, who had known Jacob for years, became an unexpected advocate. "I've watched Jacob Whitmore for more than a decade," he told the territorial judge. "He's as decent a man as you'll find in these parts, and that child has thrived under his care. She's gained weight, she's healthy, and she's clearly devoted to him. What more could you ask for?" The judge, a stern-faced man named Morrison, who took his responsibilities seriously, was more concerned with propriety than practicality. "It's highly irregular," he said, peering at Jacob over his wire-rimmed spectacles. "A single man raising a young girl without female supervision. What about her moral education, her preparation for womanhood?" Jacob had anticipated this objection and came prepared with his answer. "Your Honor, I've already spoken with Mrs. Patterson in town about giving Emma lessons in the domestic arts that I can't teach her myself, and Reverend Collins has agreed to provide religious instruction. She'll have proper guidance in all the areas where my knowledge falls short." It was Emma herself who ultimately swayed the judge's decision. When asked directly what she wanted, she stood up straight and spoke with a clarity that belied her young years. "I want to stay with Jacob," she said simply. "He saved my life, and he's been nothing but good to me. He's taught me how to work and how to read better, and he never gets angry when I have bad dreams about Mama and Papa. He's the best father a girl could ask for, and I don't want anybody else." The judge studied her for a long moment, then turned to Jacob. "Mr. Whitmore, do you understand the full scope of what you're undertaking? This child will need guidance and support well into her adult years. Are you prepared for that commitment?" "Yes, sir," Jacob replied without hesitation. "I am." "Very well. I'm satisfied that this arrangement serves the child's best interests. The adoption is approved." The day the paperwork was finalized, Jacob took Emma to the general store and bought her a new dress, blue as a summer sky, to celebrate. She wore it to dinner at the hotel restaurant, sitting up straight and using her best manners, while Jacob marveled at how much she had changed since that day he had found her crying by the roadside. "So I'm really Emma Whitmore now?" she asked, testing the sound of her new name. "If that's what you want," Jacob said, "though you'll always be a Morrison too. That's where you came from, and it's nothing to be ashamed of." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "Emma Catherine Morrison Whitmore. That's a lot of names for one person." "Well, you're a lot of person," Jacob said, and was rewarded with one of her brilliant smiles that never failed to light up his world. Winter came early that year, blanketing the ranch in snow that transformed the harsh landscape into something beautiful and serene. Jacob taught Emma to ice fish and to track rabbits through the snow. She learned to milk their cow and to card wool from their small flock of sheep. In the evenings they would sit by the fire while Emma practiced her letters and numbers, Jacob helping her work through the arithmetic problems in the worn textbook they had ordered from town. It was during one of these quiet winter evenings that Emma asked a question that revealed how deeply she had been thinking about their situation. "Jacob," she said, not looking up from her slate, "do you ever get lonely? I mean, before I came here, were you sad all by yourself?" The question caught Jacob off guard with its perceptiveness. He had grown so accustomed to having Emma in his life that he had almost forgotten the hollow ache of those solitary years after Sarah's death. "Yes," he said honestly, "I was lonely, sadder than I like to admit, even to myself. I thought I was getting along just fine, but I was really just existing, not living." Jacob looked at this remarkable child who had brought such unexpected richness to his life. "Now I remember what it feels like to have something worth protecting, worth fighting for. You gave me back my purpose, Emma. You reminded me that there's still good in the world worth preserving." Emma set down her chalk and moved to sit beside him on the rough wooden bench he had built. "I'm glad you found me," she said simply. I don't know what would have happened to me if you hadn't stopped that day." "I'm glad too," Jacob said, putting his arm around her small shoulders. "More glad than I can properly express." As winter deepened, they settled into routines that felt as natural as breathing. Emma proved to have a gift for storytelling, spinning elaborate tales during the long evenings that kept Jacob entertained and amazed. She had inherited her mother's creativity and her father's determination, combined with a resilience that seemed entirely her own. One particularly harsh night, when the wind howled around the cabin like a living thing and the snow piled high against the windows, Emma woke screaming from a nightmare about her parents. Jacob found her sitting up in bed, tears streaming down her face, calling out for her mother in a voice that broke his heart. "I'm here," he said softly, sitting on the edge of her bed and gathering her into his arms. "You're safe, Emma. I'm here." "I dreamed they were calling for me," she sobbed against his shoulder. "They were lost in the snow and they needed help, but I couldn't find them. I tried and tried, but they kept getting farther away." Jacob held her until the sobs subsided, stroking her hair and murmuring the same comforting words Sarah had once used when their own daughter had nightmares. "It was just a dream," he said. "Your parents aren't lost, Emma. They're at peace. And you're exactly where you're supposed to be." "Promise?" she whispered. "I promise," Jacob said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Spring arrived with an explosion of wildflowers that transformed their valley into a carpet of color. Emma, now taller and stronger after a winter of good food and careful tending, threw herself into the work of planting their expanded garden. She had proven to have Sarah's gift for coaxing life from reluctant soil, and under her care their vegetable patch promised to be more productive than it had been in years. On a warm May morning, almost exactly 1 year after Jacob had found Emma by the roadside, they stood together on their front porch, surveying the ranch that had become their shared home. Emma was no longer the hollow-eyed, desperate child he had rescued. She was still small for her age, but she radiated the quiet confidence of someone who knew she was loved and valued. "Jacob," she said, slipping her hand into his, "do you think things work out the way they're supposed to? I mean, do you think maybe Mama and Papa dying and you finding me happened for a reason?" It was a question Jacob had wrestled with many times over the past year. The theological implications were beyond him, but the practical reality was undeniable. They had saved each other, this unlikely pair. Emma had given him back his capacity for love and hope, while he had given her safety and stability and the chance to heal from wounds that might have destroyed someone with less resilience. "I don't know about divine plans," he said honestly, "but I know that finding you was the best thing that's happened to me since Sarah died. I know that you've made me a better man, Emma. You've reminded me what it means to have something worth protecting." Emma squeezed his hand tighter. "I used to think life must hate me, to take away Mama and Papa like that. But now I think maybe it just had a different plan. Maybe it knew you needed me as much as I needed you." Jacob looked down at this remarkable child who had somehow managed to find wisdom in tragedy, strength in loss, and hope in the midst of despair. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps some greater design had been at work that day when he had stopped his wagon to investigate a small figure crying by the roadside. Or perhaps it had simply been the random intersection of need and compassion, the kind of everyday miracle that happened when people chose kindness over convenience. Either way, Jacob knew that Emma Catherine Morrison Whitmore had become the most important thing in his world. She was his daughter now, not by blood, but by choice. Not by accident, but by love. And as they stood together watching the sun rise over the mountains that framed their home, Jacob felt something he had thought lost forever. The absolute certainty that tomorrow would be worth seeing, and that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. In the distance, a meadowlark sang its liquid song to the morning sky, and Emma laughed with pure, uncomplicated joy. The sound echoed across the prairie, carrying with it the promise of all the tomorrows yet to come, all the love yet to be shared, all the healing yet to be accomplished by two people who had found each other exactly when they needed it most. The little girl who had once cried by the roadside was crying no more.